So this is me in the Bronx in late November 2012, working with the US Marshal Service Fugitive Task Force, oldest law enforcement agency in the United States, and I was able to introduce negotiation tactics to them in terms of apprehending fugitives, as opposed to just using force. So I've dealt with a lot of incidents under quite significant pressure, but I wanted to start by giving you a video and just a bit of a Hollywood insight into my world.
Yeah, I like animals better than people sometimes, especially dogs. Dogs are the best. Every time you come through the door, they treat you as if they haven't seen you in a year. And the good thing about dogs, they got different kinds of dogs for different kinds of people. Like pit bull, the dog of dogs. Pit bull can be the right man's best friend, the wrong man's worst enemy. Yeah, you're gonna give me a dog for a pet. Give me a pit bull. Give me Raul. Right, Omar? Give me Raul.
I fucking hate Raul! Shut the fuck up, asshole! Son of a bitch, don't understand!
Peace, Raul. Probably fucked up the list. Yeah, I can dig it, Omar. I had a dog like that. A poodle. She didn't bark, though. She pissed on the floor. Hated that dog. If I was ever depressed, she'd lay her head in my lap, look up at me with those big old eyes. And even though I thought I hated that dog, I loved her. Like that, ain't it, Omar? That love-hate thing.
So there you can see is The Negotiator, which is from the film The Negotiator, changing the subject and trying to engage with the perpetrator who's got somebody hostage. And that is what we do. We tend to be a jack of all trades, so we can talk about lots and lots of different things, but we apply a lot of psychology to these incidents. So today I want to cover a number of different areas with you. How do I control my emotions, and what are the key attributes of a good negotiator? How do we deal with ego, which is a big barrier to any effective communication? How do we actively listen? There's a reason we have 2 ears and 1 mouth, and it's how we use our listening skills and how we're empathic. A lot of people confuse empathy with sympathy, but being empathic allows you to make a really good and deep connection with someone. And then once you've built a rapport with somebody, how you can be persuasive and how you can influence them using the power of suggestibility and some of the dynamics of compliance, which I'll give you in a bit more detail. And then how you understand and apply behavioral change in others, creating that win-win result. So one of the things that has served me well in over 20 years of negotiating are these 6 Ps. Preparation, planning, psychological aspects, which I'll cover in a little bit of detail. Practice, so training practice and practicing with colleagues is very important. Patience, my wife says that I'm very patient. I sometimes doubt it, but she says I am. And persistence, so our ability to be persistent under a lot of pressure. And one of the things that is a very common mistake among a lot of people, particularly in the business world, is that they go to meetings and they've got everything in their head in terms of their own agenda, the targets they need to meet, the things they need to say. And the consequence of that is you don't actually listen to what's being said. So what do I look for in terms of negotiators? I've trained negotiators for over 20 years. One of the things that for me is really important, and this applies globally, is our ability to be polite and courteous. I'm sure you all remember your parents telling you to use please and thank you as a child. That's actually still very important, but sometimes in certain cultures that's missing. But being courteous is very important, as is being empathic. Now, we all have a life, a different life. We've all lived different experiences, and sometimes sharing some of that experience allows you to really connect with a person. And empathy for me is like having one foot in your own camp and one foot in the other person's camp, so you can understand to a large degree how they feel. And it's very important when you actually actively listen to them. We have to be non-authoritarian, which for ex-police officers is really difficult because we've been in an authoritarian world for, and certainly in my case, over 30 years. So we've got to be conscious of that. We've got to have good verbal skills so that we can speak to the janitor as well as the chief executive. We've got to be very calm, calm under a lot of pressure, and have this cognitive ability to be flexible in our thinking, because sometimes you don't get all the information. So you've got to piece it together like a jigsaw, and it's our ability to do that whilst under pressure. We don't take up the challenge. So I've had 30 years of people shouting and swearing at me, and I'm very good at absorbing that. But as you absorb that, very important in terms of self-care is that you're able to look after yourself, because you do absorb some of that venom that comes out of some people, particularly when they're highly emotional. And you've got to be able to tolerate a huge degree of ambiguity and uncertainty, because you don't know what all the facts of the incident are. Now, one of the things that I've done throughout my career in hostage crisis negotiation within policing, and I still do it to this day, is one of the things that I do is I devise a negotiation strategy. So what do I want to achieve as I'm hurtling towards the incident in a car? And 9 times out of 10 within the law enforcement world, that is getting somebody to a safe place or releasing hostages from a perpetrator. In the humanitarian world where I work now, that is sometimes negotiating access to a refugee camp with armed groups. So it's how do we do that safely? But it's very important to have a strategy in terms of knowing where you're going to go. It's how you then actively listen to glean information. And I took this picture. This is my daily walk. And you'll see that there is a tower and a tree. Now, a lot of people view a negotiation and a dialogue as a linear process. So they start at the bottom of the tower and want to reach the top. And sometimes you can do that, but you don't get a lot of fruit in terms of that depth of conversation, that depth of connection with somebody, unless you already know them. And most of the negotiations that I've had with people that I don't know, that are usually in really difficult places in their life, where they're perhaps trying to take their own life, is I've got to have that patience. And my negotiation strategy is the trunk of the tree. But as people put up verbal barriers because they don't want to discuss the key issue, I go take the conversation down a branch, because I know that by going down that branch, I can get some real good fruit in terms of the depth of that conversation. And that allows me to build a deeper connection with an individual. So don't be afraid to branch out, but remember, you must be able to steer that conversation back in to your main strategy as you move forward. So emotional self-control. I got told during a negotiation for one of our country directors who was kidnapped in Afghanistan when we were negotiating with the Taliban. We did role play as a team, and one of my Afghan colleagues said, "I can't get angry at you." He said, "It doesn't matter what I say to you, I can't get angry because you're very calm. You speak slowly, albeit in Scots, and you have a very calm presence about you." Now, not everybody has that, but that's something that you can develop. So as I'm going towards a job, and most of the jobs that I've gone to, I actually don't know what I'm going to deal with. So I'm very conscious of my own state of mind. So I know that I'm going to a job that will involve a lot of pressure. And I try and empty my head of all the things that I shouldn't be thinking about. For example, you know, what do I do when I get home? You know, do I need to go shopping? And all these other small things that distract you from the job in hand. So by doing that, and it's almost a form of meditation, by doing that, that allows me to focus. And as I focus, it allows me to then breathe, to make sure that I'm grounded before I arrive. And I know what works well for me. And I've learned that through a lot of practice under pressure. I learned it through training. And I've also learned it through my own life experience. So I know what works for me in a pressure situation. And this part is very important. As negotiators within law enforcement, and certainly in the humanitarian world, I don't tell lies. Because if we tell lies, what happens? We eventually get caught out. And if you get caught out in a lie, what happens? All the trust that you have built up disappears. And not only disappears for you, but it can disappear for your entire team and sometimes even your organization. So it's very important to make authentic connections, to be genuine in your conversations with people, and to rely on the tools and methods developed by experts. A lot of the tools that I will talk through today have been developed through really good academic research and really good practitioner experience. We know that in terms of traditional questioning, this is what we all do, is we meet somebody for the first time and we want to ask lots and lots of questions. And we want to solve people's problems. We can be quite intrusive. We just look for the facts, and we look for control. And these actually have a negative impact on developing rapport. It creates pressure in the dialogue, can provoke somebody to be very defensive, can also create barriers, and it can create a bit of confusion. So a really good example from the humanitarian world was when we were in one of the areas in Nigeria, an IDP camp. We were meeting the IDPs who had fled Boko Haram for the first time. Now, my young team leader had a list of questions that he wanted to ask as we did the needs assessment. And I said to him, I said, I want you to put that away. I said, we know that these people are from a farming community, so they're farmers. So all the elders came to speak to me because I'm tall and I've got grey hair. And I talked about farming. I talked about family, and probably spent about 30 minutes talking about some of the challenges that they have with the crops, with the animals. I talked about families in terms of the children's development. And I eventually came to the point saying, the reason that we're here is our organisation provides education. And the elder from the village said, oh yes, we know why you're here. And we have prepared all the information that you require. And he handed over a sheet of paper with a list of all the children, all their educational levels, the children in different levels of education, and the 4 teachers within the community and their qualifications. And the team leader looked at me and said, you've managed to get all the information I need, but you've hardly asked any questions. And I said, but that's because I've listened. So your ability to actively listen is huge. And you can get a lot of information from that without asking what we would normally do in terms of lots and lots of questions. So in terms of how we deal with ego, active listening is really important. And I'll cover that in a little bit of detail shortly. Be empathic. So try to understand how the other person feels. And you might not like the other person, you might not like their ego, but try and understand how they feel. Keep to the facts. Don't say, I think. Keep to the facts of what you're talking about. So if you make it hard evidence and factual, then that's very difficult for them to argue against. And you don't get into an argument. You just present the facts. Sometimes you'll need to use a reality check because some of their expectations might be way beyond what you can actually deliver. So use reality checks that keep them grounded. And this is a quote from the Godfather. Don't take it personally, it's business. A lot of us sometimes feel quite wounded in a dialogue with somebody who is egotistical because they might be quite abusive. It's not personal. This is about business. So you need to be able to absorb that and then continue with your dialogue. You will also find that people who are egotistical, they suck your energy. So if there becomes a point in that dialogue, you need a break or you recognize you're getting tired, then you manufacture something, say for example, going to the restroom, that allows you to get a break, allows you just to breathe, and that allows you to then go back in. So dealing with egos is very, very difficult. But these are some of the key things that I've used that have been very helpful. And this is the model that we have used within law enforcement. There are different models. The behavioural change staircase came in the 1970s, just when hostage crisis negotiation was in its infancy within law enforcement. It was developed by the FBI and their behavioural science unit. So it's based on really good sound academic research, but it's also supplemented by practice and experience. It works, and it works very well. I use it as a framework so that I can stand back at some point and think, okay, where am I on my progress up the staircase? And we use active listening, and active listening underpins the whole thing. And as we use active listening, we then use empathy to try to understand how somebody feels. And that these two things combined naturally lead to rapport building. And you know when you've got rapport building, because the dialogue flows very easily. It's actually not difficult. It goes back and forward quite easily, and there's more of a flow to it. It's not jilted or stuttered. It should flow quite easily. And when you're in that space, that's when you can start to apply some of the tactics in terms of persuasion and influence. And I'll talk about these shortly. But the most dangerous time is when you think you're about to achieve that behavioural change. And you see it with salespeople an awful lot of the time, as they get to that point and in their mind, they have got the sale. And 9 times out of 10, the person hasn't actually signed the contract or handed over the money. And then they've picked up on the fact that the salesman has relaxed. And then what tends to happen is the other side then says, no, sorry, I'm not signing the contract. And they walk away from it. So the most dangerous time is just before you see that behavioural change. And I say to a lot of people, the analogy I use is Usain Bolt. So when Usain Bolt runs the 100 meters, he just doesn't run to the 100-meter line. He runs beyond it. So it's very important in a negotiation when you use this model is that you continue until you see that behavioural change. And that's vitally important. What's also very important, and you'll recognise this, both within a work setting and a family setting, where people's emotions are high, you can't use any kind of rational conversation with them because they're not rational. They're highly emotional. They might be shouting and swearing at you. So how do you bring them down to a level where you can have that normal conversation? You slow your pace, you reduce the volume of your voice, and they will naturally come down to meet you. The only exception that I've experienced is where people are perhaps on drugs and they can shout and swear at you for quite a considerable amount of time. But that's down to your ability to absorb that and then to keep calm until they come down. And once they've come down, then to have that rational conversation with them. When somebody is low emotionally, say, severely depressed, it's how you then lift them with your voice. One of the techniques that I use it quite often when I'm coaching people, is everybody thinks they're very good at telling a story. So I get them to read The Gruffalo. Now I've got a 6-year-old daughter, and I tell them, I want you to read this as if you would read it to a small child. And a lot of them who've come from pressured environments race through the book. And what they don't use is they don't use your voice. You don't use your voice to describe the Gruffalo as if you're describing it to a small child for the first time, trying to paint that picture in your head. So your voice is a tool, and it's very important that you learn to use it. As we look at problems, most of us would look at the red dot in the center of the picture, and we would focus on that problem. And what that then does is that means that people then want to problem solve for somebody else. I'm sure you've all had people telling you what to do, parents, friends, colleagues, saying, oh, I think you should do this, I think you should do this, and they try and solve the problem for you. That doesn't work because you don't have ownership of the solution. So as negotiators, what we do is we stand back, we look at the psychology of the individual, we look at their culture. Culture is very, very important. And we look at the situational context of where they are just now. We don't problem solve, but what we do is try and guide them towards a resolution. So we'd use things like suggestibility. You know, can I suggest that you look at this? You're not giving them the solution to the problem, you're pointing them in the right direction. And it's very important that the individual comes up with the solution, because if they come up with a solution, they are more likely to do something about it in terms of ownership and actually action in terms of that solution. So active listening skills, which have been described as the stealth weapon of effective negotiation by one of the Harvard professors. Now we use what you can all see as more pies, and that is not a Scottish thing. Now this is an acronym that is used throughout the hostage negotiation world in law enforcement, and it's also used within the military. Minimal encouragers are these small sounds that you make, it might be, okay, all right, that you make in a conversation with somebody. And where you don't get them, what you tend to get from the other side is, are you listening? Open-ended questions. We all know that if we use closed questions, we can get a yes or no answer. If you use an open-ended question, for example, who, what, why, where, when, you're more likely to elicit more information. You might use a reflection or mirroring. So somebody might say to you, well, I'm really frustrated. And you might reflect back, frustrated? And use the inflection in your voice to ask a question. And that question is about the emotion. And I'll talk a little bit about emotional labels shortly. Paraphrasing is where we repeat back to the other person what they've said to us, but we do it in our own words. An I message is something that is used to challenge somebody, but it's a non-confrontational way to do it. And it has three parts to it. It has the problem, the feeling, and the effect. So you might say, I feel upset when you behave like that because it's not right. So that's an I message, and that talks about your own emotion. It doesn't say no, you shouldn't behave like that, which is confrontational. Effective pauses, and again, I'll use this shortly because this is really important, and we tend not to use it because we want to fill that void. When you're talking to somebody in a pub, for example, when somebody is quiet, somebody always wants to jump into that void to speak. And using an effective pause is a very, very important technique. Emotional labeling. I'm going to put up a number of different pictures. And what tends to happen is that we view these emotions, and we all view them differently because we all have our own different biases. So you could have a number of ideas in terms of the emotions there. That person looks tired, they look exhausted, they might look sad. We don't know. But the reality is that's a picture of somebody who's just tired. We have this lady here, that looks like she's overcome by joy. And she is overcome by joy because she's just found her son, who was missing for 6 weeks during Hurricane Katrina. This lady has just watched her football team miss a penalty at the World Cup. But you might think she's absolutely horrified, and she is horrified because her team has missed a penalty. Or you might think she's horrified because she's seen something traumatic. This is a very typical picture from Scotland. This is golfing in the rain. And that person might look miserable, but he might actually be enjoying himself because he's golfing. This is a referee who's caught somebody out. And this is a little boy who's probably having the best day of his life. So as we view emotions, we view them from our own lens. And sometimes we don't get it right. Ladies are actually much better at picking up on emotions. They're more intuitive and can read emotions better. Men, we're not that great at it, particularly Scottish men. So one of the things that we use is we use an emotional label. So I might say to somebody, oh, you sound frustrated. And if I get that wrong, they'll come back and correct me. And they'll say, no, I'm not frustrated, Andy. I'm really angry. And that then allows me to ask an open question. An effective pause. It's immediately before or after something meaningful. It helps to focus that thought and interaction. It shows the conversation is in turn. How do you feel when somebody constantly interrupts your conversation? It annoys you. So it's about having that social contract. And it can also be a very effective response to anger. And I use that effectively because I'm a big guy, so I can be silent, but I can use my physical presence to make a real statement in terms of somebody that's been angry towards me. So using an effective pause and using silence is very, very effective in any sort of negotiation. But we also must remember, and this is what we're quite bad at doing in the modern world, is we want to say lots and lots of things. And that is different in different dialogues. And there's a piece of research from 1956 by George Miller, who looked at our ability to store information in our brain. And one of the things that I do with students is I'll get them to write a list of 7 items. I'll then get them to whisper that from person to person throughout the class. And I can almost guarantee you that the most items that will be read back out to me will be maximum of 5. So it's very difficult people to retain more than 7 pieces of information. And just think about the last conversation you had. How much information did you impart? And it's like that message that we talked from the trenches in the First World War. There was a soldier who was given a message by one of the captains and said, I want you to send for reinforcements, we're going to advance. So that message passed from trench to trench to trench. And the final messenger gave it to the other captain. Oh, I've got a message to give you, sir. What's the message? Give me 4 and 6pence, we're going to a dance. So the message changes, and it's really important that you keep communication short and concise so that people can remember it. And then you summarize so that not only do you know you're on the right page, but the other person's on the right page too. You'll recognize this guy. This guy is Aristotle, who taught Alexander the Great. And he talked about, in terms of his philosophy, 3 things, 3 pillars of persuasion. Ethos, or credibility. So it's about knowing your stuff, showing your track record, and establishing a common ground. Pathos, which is the emotion. So it's about how you tell your story, how you make that connection, and how you appeal to the higher level needs of the other side. And then logos is the logical ask, where you get to that point where you just make that logical ask. This was invented hundreds of years ago, and it still works. Still works to this day. But part of the scientific research that's gone on since then, Robert Cialdini and Steve Martin did a number of different scientific studies. and brought this together. And what happened was they came up with 6 shortcuts to get that influence there. And that was reciprocity, scarcity, authority, consistency, liking, and consensus. And these all work. So reciprocity, if I give you something that's unexpected and personalized, then you feel that you need to give something back to me. Scarcity, when Concorde stops its flights or announced that we're stopping the flights back and forward between London and New York, the number of people that wanted these flights went up because it became a scarce resource. Authority, if I was in uniform as a police officer and I needed change for a parking meter, then I was more likely to get change from a member of the public because I was in uniform. And it's the same if you go into a doctor's surgery or the dentist's, where you see their certificates on the wall. It gives you that reassurance in terms of their authority. Consistency, we're round about how you're consistent in terms of your approach. And then liking, we all know that when you go to buy something, the salesperson will try to talk to you, and then you might think, well, I like this person, or you do business with people that you like. And that makes it a lot easier because you communicate a lot better. And then consensus is where, for example, you go to the hotel and there's a small sign in the bathroom that tells you, you know, X number of percentage of people that use this bathroom have recycled their towels, don't change their towels every day. So this is about using the power of persuasion in terms of getting people to comply. And ladies will recognize that advert, which is very, very successful for L'Oreal, because a lot of ladies would say to their husbands, you know, I want you to get me some L'Oreal perfume or products. And the husband might say, well, you know, you've got enough products. And then the reaction to that is, am I not worth it? So in terms of an advert, it's very, very impactful. One of the other tricks that we have up our sleeves is we put together what is called a bunch of 5s, and it's not a punch in the face. It's 5 different ways to say the same thing. And what you tend to find in dialogue is people will present a barrier, and that barrier, it usually hides the key issue that they don't want to talk about at that time in the conversation. And a lot of time when we're under pressure, we hit that barrier and then we circle around and we ask the same thing and we keep hitting the same barrier, and that causes frustration. One of the ways to get around that barrier is to perhaps frame the question differently. And that sometimes allows the other person to let you past. So think about how you can ask a particular question 5 different ways, and frame it 5 different ways. And as a toolkit, that's very, very important. It also keeps you cognitively agile in a negotiation. Working with a humanitarian agency right across the world, we've got 58 missions across the world. I've learned very much in how culture impacts on communication. In a high context culture, so for example, Afghanistan or China, communication is very indirect. It's implied, it's very subtle, and it's layered and it's nuanced. So sometimes from a Western world, that takes us a little bit of time to get used to, but it's very, very important in terms of how you communicate in that culture. In a Western culture, we're low context culture, so we are concise, we're straightforward, we're very explicit, simple and clear. And we're quite comfortable doing that. We're quite comfortable having disagreements professionally. And that's how we operate in a low context culture. But if you do that in a high context culture, then you can cause great offense and you can cause people to lose face. And that means in terms of any trust that you might have built up, it's gone completely. We look at the psychological aspects. The psychological aspects are a really useful tool, particularly from my world, but also from the general world, where you're dealing with people that that have a number of different disorders, whether it be psychotic disorders, mood disorder, personality disorders. And there are a number of different strategies you can use for these types of individuals that help inform your strategy on how you negotiate with these individuals under pressure. We mustn't forget generational influences too. You speak to your parents very differently as you would speak to your children, because your parents, they've come from a generation where they demand respect, whereas the younger generation, the generation now, very, very different outlook on life, very different experience. So you speak to them differently. So it's very important that you take cognizance of that when you're framing your negotiation and looking into who you deal with. And as you deal with demands, I'm sure you can imagine from my world that we deal with demands quite often. And one of the things that we do as hostage negotiators is we lower expectations. We control the emotions. We talk through demands. We might get demand on a deadline, but we've got to talk through that deadline. We don't invite more demands. So a number of times I've taught classes where people say, well, what do you want? In the hostage crisis world, and when you're doing exercises, that usually invites a ridiculous demand. Okay, so don't self-impose deadlines, which a lot of us do. Say, I'll get back to you in 2 minutes. You'll get some people who will sit and look at their watch and wait until that 2 minutes is up and then say, why have you not got back to me? Use reality checks, because some people don't think, you know, what they're asking is unrealistic. So reality check is a really good way to ground them. And it also allows you to buy some time. Buying time is really important because it takes pressure off of you and it allows you to get more information as you continue your negotiation. And I'll come back to this. One of the things that we can do nowadays in terms of preparation is we can do research. So when you're going into a meeting, you can prepare and you can research some of the individuals you're going to go and meet. And you can do that on LinkedIn, you can do it on social media. You can read articles. If you read articles, you can pick up on how somebody communicates by how they write. Planning. You might plan your negotiation. And most importantly, look at the psychological aspects if they are there, but practice. Practice with your friends and your colleagues. Say, we're about to go to this meeting. This is all the preparation done. I want to just do a dry run. And what that allows you to do, that allows you to map that in your head, in your brain, as to you anticipate naturally some of the questions that you'll get. You've already thought of some of the answers. And it allows you to anticipate some of the difficulties that you might encounter, which means you're better prepared. Patience. You might not always achieve the result in the first meeting, and you just need to accept that. Some people move at a different pace, and your first meeting might just be about building rapport. And then how do you then set up the second meeting? And persistence. It's not giving up, no matter how difficult it is. And a lot of the negotiations I've dealt with have been highly emotional, have been very, very difficult, where the commodity is someone's life. I don't have an option to give up because somebody's life's involved. And for me, it's that persistence. But when you are persistent, really, really important that you look after yourself. And for me, this is a quote from Winston Churchill. And I think, particularly when you're negotiating under pressure, it's really, really important. Courage is what it takes to stand up and speak. Courage is also what it takes to sit down and listen. And I think listening, active listening, is one of the key skills that we all have, but we need to practice in terms of how we empathically support others to find a solution.